Welcome to our first Midweek Mysteries of the new year, and thank you all for being here. I am your host, Nick Ryan. If you're new to the show, Midweek Mysteries is a shorter version of our regular episodes, where we also enjoy giving a personal thank you to our newest supporters, so be sure to tune in on Sunday as well. If you're interested in supporting us, please consider sharing, reviewing, and subscribing to the show. And if you'd like to take the next step, please visit us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal, where you can make a one-time donation. Your support in any form makes the show possible. And if you've encountered the paranormal and you'd like to share your story, please email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. All experiences, no matter how big or small, are always welcome. Now, I know that I said that there wasn't going to be a show today, but I pulled some strings and brought some recording equipment with me while I'm out of town. So if tonight's audio sounds a little different, that's why. So with that out of the way, let's see what today's storytellers have in store for us. Today's first midweek mystery comes to us from Lou. Lou says, "Hi Nick. When I came across your podcast about 1 year ago, I started listening to it whenever I could. At first I wasn't sure if my story would fit in, because it's about a dream visitation, but then I heard about other stories that had something to do with dreams and spirits, so I decided that I would send this one to you. It might not be very creepy or extraordinary, but it's a very important and emotional experience for me. So here is a little backstory to that experience. 5 years before I was born, my mother bought herself a horse named Holly. It was a male horse, although the name might sound female. He also had the branding number 465, which will become important later. I met him for the first time when I was just 6 days old. Growing up, I spent almost every day with him, going on adventures in the woods, having riding lessons, or just being near him. Holly was more of a friend, a teacher, and guardian for me than just a horse. When he got older, he started to struggle with his health, but we still went on walks together, because as long as we were both by each other's side, we were fine and happy. Finally, in 2017, when I was 16 years old and he was 26, Holly passed away due to an injury in his leg. This day has been the worst day of my entire life, because out of all the things in my life, I loved him the most. Although I still miss him every day, I started to move on with my life, and about 1.5 years after his passing is when my experience took place. The days before that event were very stressful, due to some issues at my workplace and a big fight between 2 team members. On Friday night, I felt upset, sad, and lonely, and started to cry before I finally fell asleep. As soon as I closed my eyes, I felt something warm pressing against my back and the back of my head. I even noticed the familiar smell of Holly's fur. All of a sudden, my vision kind of moved so I could see myself laying in my bed from above. Holly was right beside me, as if he wanted to make sure that I was all right. Hours went by, and he didn't move. He just watched over me. Then in the middle of the night, I woke up because I had to use the bathroom. I felt strange, because it all had seemed so real. When I returned, I thought that the dream was over, and that Holly wouldn't be there anymore. But when I fell asleep again, he was. He stayed there, all night. Since then, he has visited me 2 more times in my dreams, but also when I am hiking in the woods, where he used to be when he was still alive. I sometimes see his branding number pop up on license plates, my smartwatch, or my phone. Now I feel like after all this time, he is still by my side, like he used to be in his lifetime. What do you think? Could he still be around, or is it just me? I would love to hear from anyone who has a similar experience. Thank you, Nick, for reading my story. I love your podcast. Kind wishes, Lou. Our next story of the night comes from Roland. Roland's story is called Hatman Takes a Life. Roland says, "How's it going? My story begins a couple of years ago. The names of the deceased have been changed out of respect to the families and myself. Around 4 to 5 years ago, I experienced sleep paralysis for the first time. I was staying the night at my grandparents' house for the weekend, and one night I randomly woke up at around 3 in the morning. I was super comfortable at this point and didn't really want to move. However, the comforter had ended up down at my waist while I was sleeping. I went to pull it up and realized that I couldn't. I was paralyzed. My eyes shot open, and immediately I saw something, rather, someone, standing at the foot of my bed. Darker than the room itself, there stood a man, hunched over in the darkness, a clear outline of a hat perched on his head, and wearing what looked to be a trench coat. I closed my eyes and started praying, and boom, it was gone. Fearing I would be looked at as crazy, I didn't want to tell anyone about my experience. I'm 21 now, and since then I've had multiple experiences with the Hatman. This year was different. My best friend, we'll call him John, was the first and really only person I got into detail with about the whole shadow person stuff that I was dealing with. Since the very beginning, he was the one I confided in. We were basically brothers, and I knew he wouldn't judge me or laugh at me when I told him some of the borderline crazy things that had happened to me over the years. Well, this year, I nearly got into a head-on collision. A car was driving the wrong way on a one-way road, and we nearly collided on a two-lane bridge. The only reason I didn't die that night was because I saw something in my rearview mirror, so I slowed down to nearly half the speed limit to safely check my back seat. It was roughly 9 p.m., so there weren't any cars out, or so I thought. When I turned my head back towards the road after checking my seat, my eyes were greeted with headlights. We played chicken and narrowly avoided a serious wreck. I told my friend John what I saw, and told him how I felt like I was supposed to die, but something intervened, and that I was going to have a run-in with death again. Well, no more than a month later, I got into a really bad accident. Luckily, no one got hurt, but if I had been going a mile an hour faster or slower, I probably would have died. John showed up to the scene, and I gave him a huge hug, feeling lucky to be alive, and I told him, "Bro, I told you this was going to happen again." We then spent the next 2 hours waiting to get my car towed, while the cops were making jokes like, "This is some Final Destination stuff," and things like that. It was really putting me on edge. A week later, I was hanging out over at John's house, and we got onto the subject of sleep paralysis. He asked me if I thought that since I had got into that wreck, that I was safe now, like I got it over with. And it was funny how he asked me that, because I was talking to the tow truck driver about that near miss a month before, and how I felt like I had a target on my back. And his response was, "Hell, maybe now you got it over with, and you'll be good." So I told John, yeah, that I did think that I was okay now. I hadn't had sleep paralysis since the wreck, and I just felt like I had a weight off of me. Then with the most serious tone, and what looked to be a tear in his eye, he asked me, "Do you think it will move on to someone else?" John's dad had died in a car accident when John was just a little boy. I told him no, that it didn't move on to him, and that he wouldn't get into an accident. He began to tear up a bit, but wiped them away and agreed that everything was fine. 3 months later, I had the worst sleep paralysis out of nowhere, but this time it wasn't a shadow. I saw him, fully in color, and what I saw haunts me. He was leaning over my paralyzed body, his face inches from mine. I spent what felt like hours trying to lift my fist to hit him. Hell, I knew I wouldn't do any damage, but I just wanted to see if what was in front of me was actually real. I eventually gave up, closed my eyes, and prayed him away, just like every other time he had appeared. I shot up out of bed covered in sweat and muscles aching from the strain that I had just endured. However, when I checked the time, only 20 minutes had passed from when I had laid down for bed. The next day at work, I told John all about it. Now, a little backstory to clarify a few things. When I would have sleep paralysis, the entire day leading up to it, I would have this weird uneasy feeling, and 9 out of 10 times I would end up having sleep paralysis. And every time I had sleep paralysis, something bad would happen in the following days. With this in mind, I told John to be on the lookout for anything bad that might happen, and to just be extra careful. Later that day at work, John's supervisor found out that he was dating his coworker, who we will call Natalie. Natalie's father definitely wouldn't have approved of their relationship, and being that he worked in IT at our job, John was extremely upset and worried that it would get back to him, and he would break them up or cause strain in the relationship. Meanwhile, I was on Reddit and found a post by someone who was looking for other people's experiences with the Hatman. After some hesitation, I began typing everything out just like I am now, and by the end of work, it was almost ready to be sent. I took a pause, saved my progress, and clocked out for the day. I went over to John's car like I always did after work to smoke a cigarette. We were both smoking, and John was clearly still torn up about the whole supervisor thing, so I suggested that we all go out to Dairy Queen and get some food to cheer him up. Everyone agreed, and we went out. Now I should mention that all day I had been getting that same feeling, the one I would get before paralysis, so I had been feeling uneasy most of the day, and typing out my story and reliving some of those memories definitely shook me up, so I just chalked it up to that. Anyway, everyone is having a great time at Dairy Queen, and we decide it's time to go home. John stops me and asks me if I want to come over and smoke some weed before he heads out to his girlfriend's house later that night. I turned him down because I was feeling uneasy about driving over there with weed, and I thought that maybe I had the weird feeling all day because I was going to get pulled over or something. That, coupled with the fact that normally a bad event follows paralysis, and I had just had it the night before, I didn't want to chance it. For some reason, John wanted to get a picture of me and him before we left. Yeah, I know, it was odd for him to ask, but for some reason I didn't give it a second thought, and we all then parted ways, and I went home. I got home and slept for about 40 minutes maybe, and I woke up to John calling me and asking me again if I wanted to hang out. I again told him no, that I was tired and was just going to stay at the house tonight. A few hours later, I was sitting on my porch swing, smoking and going over my story on Reddit, checking it for spelling errors before I sent it. All right, I think I'm good, I think to myself, and I hit send. I began to think a lot about my experiences, and I honestly prayed for a way to make it stop. I prayed hard, almost as hard as when I got arrested exactly a year before. I had been arrested a year before on my way home from helping John move back to Texas from Arizona. He had been living out there for a couple of years after high school, but wanted to come back to spend some time with his family and to try to help them with bills. So me and my buddy decided that we were going to drive up there, load up his stuff, and bring him back. A classic road trip. We finally made it back to Texas, and my feet were covered in blisters, and I hadn't slept in 3 days. I dropped off John at his mom's house, hopped in my car, which we had left at John's mom's house, and took my other buddy home. I dropped him off, and no more than 5 miles away from my house, I got pulled over and arrested for having a couple grams of weed on me. At this point, it was just after 10 a.m. on June 30th. I spent the night in jail, and thankfully I got out early the next morning, after praying harder than I've ever prayed in my life. Well, like I said, I sent my story to the user on Reddit, which was the first and only person other than John who I've told. I began praying for an answer, a way to stop it. Anything really. I had this image of a sword sitting on my bed. Somehow in my heart I could feel that the sword was there, that I would go inside, and it would be my tool against the darkness. Lame, I know. However, my prayers were cut short by a phone call. It was John's girlfriend. He had left earlier to go to her house, and he was on the phone with her when all of a sudden he said, "Oh my God," and the phone call dropped. She was worried and was begging me to go check on him and basically drive the path he would have taken to get to her house. In my mind, I'm telling myself that his phone just died, and he would show up at her place any minute, and she would call me telling me to turn around, and that she was sorry for wasting my time. But that call never came. I followed the road for a while, and she stayed on the phone with me, because she didn't want to be alone, and she was quite frankly having a panic attack, and I didn't feel right hanging up on her, so I just tried to reassure her that everything was fine, as I was making the 30-minute drive to her house. I pulled onto the road that leads to her house, the road that John would always call her from, because it was exactly 10 minutes from her house to the start of the road, if that makes sense. It was at that point that I saw blue and red lights coming up behind me, and something deep in me knew that something had happened to John. I asked his girlfriend if I could please call her back once I had found something, because I was nervous driving those back roads with one hand. I just didn't want to be on the phone with her in case I too began to freak out. I kept driving. The first responder was now off in the distance as I finally passed Natalie's house. There was still no sign of John, so I kept driving. I drove for another 10 minutes, biting my nails and chain-smoking cigarettes. As I came around the last corner, the sheer amount of red and blue lights was deafening. It was pure chaos. I parked my car and began walking up to the center of the mess. First responders, cops, and paramedics were running past me like I didn't exist, until I see it. John's white Impala, mangled to the point that you couldn't even tell that it was a car. John died that night, right around 10 p.m. on June 30th, exactly 1 year to the hour that we got him back from Arizona. Not only that, but the officer that was there and told us that he didn't make it was the same officer that had arrested me exactly 1 year before. The odds of that were slim to none. The whole thing was crazy, depressing, terrifying, and the worst experience of my life. I lost a brother that night, a true friend, and the Hatman definitely had something to do with it. 3 days later, me and 3 close friends of John's went to his car to retrieve anything that his family might want to keep, and nestled in the car was a sword that John got from the Renaissance Fair a few years before. It was untouched. We took a picture with the car to remember him and went back to his mom's to give her the items we had recovered. I went to hand her the sword and she said, "No, John wanted you to have that if he ever passed away." Apparently, he had talked to her about his death days before it happened and told her what items he wanted all of us to have, and he told her that he just wanted to be cremated and he would be happy. I went home and laid the sword on my bed, and then it hit me. That's exactly what I saw in my head right before John's girlfriend called me that tragic night. It's been nearly 5 months since then, and I had not had sleep paralysis until last night. I'm going to bring the sword to the site of his accident. If I don't survive, this is my story. There are many more details I'm leaving out, as it would take me way too long to write them all down, and I'm not a good writer, so it would only serve to confuse more than the story already has. This story is 100% real and painful. Losing a best friend or family member is a devastating experience, and although not everyone can understand the special bond that you share with the one you've lost, we do understand the pain that comes with it. I believe that our loved ones are always with us, and Lou's and Roland's stories are proof of that, and I sincerely hope that over the following months and years, that both of our storytellers continue to find peace in the fact that their loved ones are always watching over them. As for the Hatman, we have yet to understand this phenomenon, as well as its intentions. Perhaps one of you will have some insight regarding this bizarre entity, and why it seems to have initiated a negative string of events within Roland's life. Please contact me if you have any advice regarding his situation. As we come to the end of this edition of Midweek Mysteries, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in and supporting the podcast, and a very special thank you goes out to Lou and Roland for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you'd like to share your thoughts or a similar experience with one of tonight's storytellers, please email me, and I'll be sure to forward your message onto them. If you've experienced something unexplainable and would like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you back here on Sunday with our next full-length episode. From all of us at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.